Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Brian Thatcher, and welcome to Mercy Unbound. It's a show that aims to provide hope and avenue for healing, and one that will help you better understand and then live the great mercy of God. With me today, I have Mr. Adam Blai. He's a church decreed expert on religious demonology and exorcism in the Diocese of Pittsburgh. He's helped train many exorcists for more than 15 years and has attended hundreds of solemn exorcisms. His journey started in brainwave research and psychology and is now focused on the realities of miracles, angels, demons, and possession. And in today's episode of Mercy Unbound, we will discuss his latest book, The History of Exorcism, available through Sophia Press at sophiainstitute.com. I've read it. It's an excellent book. You can tell he put a lot of work in this. There's many references and he knows his stuff. And I'm just tickled to have Mr. Adam Blai on the show today. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Doctor.
Walk us through what experiences led you to go from brainwave research and psychology into demonology and exorcism.
Well, of course, it's a long story, but essentially, in doing research on consciousness, essentially brain organization changes using kind of advanced signal processing of EEG through coherency analysis to kind of roughly determine how signals are moving in the brain, particularly posterior, anterior, posterior, left, right, and then some specific focused lobes of the brain. We would bring in completely healthy students and hypnotize them, first in groups, find highly hypnotizable people, and then extremely low unhypnotizable people, bring them in for a one-on-one study. Now, this is before, of course, I knew the church forbids hypnosis, and I wasn't deeply involved in the church at that time, born and raised Catholic, but, I wasn't thinking that way. I was more thinking as a researcher. So I saw that you could induce hallucinations in a completely healthy brain without mental illness through hypnosis. You can make people see things that aren't there, not see things that are there, have different sensory experiences, turn off their sense of smell and put ammonia under their nose and they don't smell it, et cetera, et cetera. And so at that time, the paranormal TV craze was just starting. It was in its infancy. It wasn't popular. It wasn't normal. It was an odd thing, and there was only one show in the world about it. And I was curious whether these people that thought they had ghost experiences were possibly having anything real, or whether it was just an artifact of their brain, or if they were just mildly mentally ill and undiagnosed, because I was trained as a clinician. I was in adult clinical psychology grad school. So I had a few years in the clinic and I was trained, systematically in diagnosis of mental illness. So I wanted to see these people for myself, talk with them, and get a sense of it. And very quickly stumbled across a possessed person, which I wasn't expecting. I was just expecting to talk to people that thought they had seen a ghost. And the possession didn't look like anything I had seen clinically. It didn't respond to the interventions that you would do clinically, didn't respond to the things that you would do in hypnosis to bring somebody out of kind of an altered state. And also just intuitively, it felt like something genuine was happening. So I hadn't decided it was real at that point, but over the years, the evidence accumulated. I was introduced to an exorcist who had been working on a very serious case for a number of years. And after chatting for a long time, he invited me to come meet the family and sit in on a session. And that was kind of my first introduction to exorcism. And it was similar to what I saw that I stumbled across. Of course, I'm not an exorcist, I'm a layperson. So there was really nothing I could do when I stumbled across it. But here I was watching a solemn exorcism where a priest with proper authority was able to actually, have an effect and do something helpful for the person. So the evidence kept accumulating, and eventually I realized I had seen so much that I couldn't explain that it had to be real. It was all real. God is real. The devil's real. There's a reason exorcism's been around for 2,000 years and it's still going, because it exists. It's in every religion in the world. Or basically every major religion in the world has some version of it. So yeah, there's more to it, of course, but eventually I was asked by the various bishops to start helping, because there was very few exorcists in those days. It was not popular. There were no exorcists on YouTube. YouTube didn't even exist. And we're in a very different world now.
Right. When you went with this priest, was that in the Diocese of Pittsburgh or was it outside?
No, it was a different diocese. I wasn't living in this diocese at that time.
Got involved in exorcisms. What is an exorcism? And you mentioned the word solemn. We've got minor, and then is a solemn the same as a major exorcism?
Right. So there's a lot to unpack there. So first off, the word exorcism technically means to give a command with an implied punishment for not obeying. So if you think of the police officer that says, get on the ground or I'm going to taser you, that's a command with an implied or explicit threat of a consequence if you don't obey, right? And we normally expect those kind of commands from people with proper authority to use kind of coercive force or threats of force in our civil society. Usually they're police officers, could be military, of course. So an exorcistic kind of prayer is very different than deliverance prayer, in that it's a command, and the implication is that God is going to back up that command with basically authority. So deliverance, to back up a little bit, is essentially, Jesus, please help this person. So it's a general prayer for healing or freedom from some kind of problem, including demonic problems. That's deliverance prayer. And that essentially says, Jesus, please help this person. So you're asking God to do it. And then it's between God and that person. What's going on? God and that spirit. If there's a spirit there, it's between them. You're not actually in the fight. You're just asking God to handle it. That's essentially what deliverance is. Exorcism is qualitatively different, because in that context, the priest is saying, in the name of Jesus, get out. And so it's not between Jesus and the demon. The priest is directly challenging the demon and giving a command. And so it's between the priest and the demon. When we think about the word solemn exorcism, that really means what we would call like the major exorcism, or solemn exorcism, the exorcism intended for possessed people. And this is, goes back to the very beginning of the church and the Gospels, and in fact before that, in the ancient Near East. Jesus, of course, did exorcisms. The church has done them the whole time, and that rite was formalized for the first time in 1614 globally within the church, and it became a fixed book that you could pick up the book, you could read the rite, which is more than just prayers. It includes psalms, it includes gospel readings, it includes long paragraphs addressing the demon directly. It includes interrogations of demanding information from it, and then adjurations, which is commanding it to leave. So when we say solemn exorcism, we're talking about an exorcism for a possessed person. When I said exorcistic prayers, commands with an implied threat that there's consequences, those are actually in a number of places in the church. It's not just in solemn exorcism that people see in the movies. There are those prayers at the end of baptisms. They're now in Latin as optional prayers, but they've always been there in baptisms, because original sin is part of creation. And so when you're being brought grafted into the mystical body of Christ through baptism, made an adopted child of God, you're presumed to be tainted by original sin, which we are, because we came to be in this context, creation is tainted by original sin. So there's an exorcism to tell the devil to get out. It's not saying that the baby is possessed, but it's saying that there's some some bit or taint of evil that is present in the form of original sin. Also in RCIA, the sequence of the process of somebody entering the church, there are exorcistic prayers in there that command the demon to leave. And this harkens back to the ancient church. When pagans would want to enter the church, they would go through a series of exorcisms over many weeks before they were baptized and the Holy Spirit was asked to enter them, because it was presumed that the pagans were filled with the spirits that they were worshiping in their pagan religions.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
go ahead.
How about in the last rites or anointing of the sick? Are there any exorcistic prayers in that? No.
No, there aren't.
Okay.
No. Um, it's it's not presumed that that would be necessary. And I think what's behind your question is the concern of, well, what if you were to die with a spirit, attached to you or inside of you? If you were, you would just go to your judgment like anybody else. It's not that you can be like dragged to hell or, somehow not go through your judgment and just be forced into hell. That's not true. You
Right.
would be separated from any spirit that's attached to you and judged on your own between you and Jesus, just like anybody else.
No, let me jump back to your brainwave because I find that fascinating as a physician. Are there been any brainwave studies done on people possessed?
No, and that's a thought that I had early on while I was still working in the lab, that would be fascinating. The problem is that a possessed person is not compliant. And so if they're in the possessed state, the demon is certainly not going to sit still. And I don't know if you've done EEG, but you have to be pretty still. As soon as there's any muscle movement, the neurons in the muscles firing will wash out what you're picking up through the dermis and the skull and everything else, which is a very weak, about a thousandth of a volt signal. Any muscle activity around here, it'll just blow all that out and make it useless. And so, unfortunately, a possessed person would not sit still, essentially. Now, that's not to say somebody somewhere hasn't tried it, but I'm not aware of it being published.
Okay. Now, what about who can do exorcisms? Just to set the record straight on that one.
Yeah. So, um, right now, and since 1614, and even before that, it's only a priest with permission from their bishop. So no deacons, no lay people, no nuns, no brothers, no sisters, only a priest with permission from their bishop. And the idea there isn't that the priest gets like the faculty to do exorcism from the bishop, but it is quite literally permission. So the faculty or the ability to do exorcisms is in the priest, comes with their ordination. They just aren't allowed to use that faculty unless the bishop gives them permission to do so in the context of solemn exorcism. So again, if they were doing a baptism and they gave an exorcistic command as part of the prayers, it would be valid and forceful because they have the faculty of exorcist in them. But if they pick up the solemn exorcism rite and start praying over a possessed person without permission, the demon is going to check them on that and say, you don't have permission, I don't have to listen to you. Quite literally, we'll tell them that. And we've seen this happen. And they know you haven't told the person anything, but the spirits know this. So one of the myths floating around on the internet is that the minor exorcism, which we haven't unpacked yet, can be done by lay people, but that's not true. So the Pope Leo XIII exorcism, written in 1890, which is called the minor exorcism, which is even reproduced on some Catholic apps with removal of the rubric, meaning the rules of it that say it can only be said by a priest with permission from their bishop. They remove that and then post it and encourage people to say it, for instance, outside of abortion clinics and things like that. They cannot be doing that. That's not allowed. And that rubric has never been abrogated or removed down through the church. So, and we have a dubia on that from 2017. I have a copy of that dubia at my office. So yeah, basically any exorcism where you're directly dealing with demons, it's a priest with permission from their bishop. And then Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was head of the CDF, really reinforced this in a letter that he wrote that was promulgated all over the world in 1986, I believe, that was trying to correct the abuses that were going on amongst lay deliverance prayer teams. And he basically said very clearly, lay people are not to speak to demons at all in any context, even if it's a deliverance prayer meeting and it's not using the solemn exorcism.
It helped me understand that what would be a minor exorcism? Uh, if the solemn is you're telling the demon to get out, and what's going on in a minor?
Right. So the minor exorcism also tells the demon to get out, but not in the context of a body, but in the context of a location, a building, land, and an object that's inanimate, these type of things. Um, that's what it's kind of intended for. It was really intended for when it was first written, it was intended for the church itself, specifically to repel the attacks of Freemasonry on the church that was really rampant back in 1890. And then it was generalized to any context where the devil is suspected to be active. So you didn't need the kind of proof that you need with a solemn exorcism. You just had to suspect, but you still needed the bishop to okay it. And so that's what Pope Leo the 13th wrote in 1890. It was kind of basically the first version of the St. Michael prayer. So the full-blown St. Michael prayer is the minor exorcism. And then over time, it was kind of changed as Freemasonry became less of a problem. It's still a problem, but less of a problem. And then they took part of it out that had no direct command in it, and that became the St. Michael prayer. And so that's kind of the lineage of where the St. Michael prayer came from. So practically, we use that for house cases. We use it for diagnosing somebody that might be possessed. It's a good way to force the demon forward, and then you can test for the signs of possession. It's used for cursed objects, and then land that may be cursed.
Got it. Adam, in our ministry, we promote the love and the mercy of God and the forgiving God. But sometimes when you go to a funeral, you almost sense in today's society that people think everybody's going to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in your area recently, a gentleman came up to me and said that he was at a retreat a couple of years ago, and a priest had said that there is no hell, and Satan, is a fiction of their minds, and it's not. It's a relic. And then in your book, I was fascinated to read that you wrote a Jesuit priest, Herbert Hogg, who said that Satan is a relic. Can you comment on that? And
yeah, so one of the tensions in the church down through history regarding exorcism is there have been moments, and it's somewhat regional too, but there have been times in the church where exorcism is very, very much at the fore, and very believed in, very discussed, used a lot. Publications are made about it. And then more recently, the book that you're referencing is a book called Goodbye to the Devil, written in 1969. And in it, he basically says, we no longer need the devil. He's a relic of the past. He's not a real personal figure. He's just an idea, essentially. And that sentiment or that hypothesis seems to have really affected the seminaries during the 70s. Now, there were people that were very much on the other side of that and still saying, it's been the consistent teaching of the church. It's part of the magisterium. It's part of the catechism. Catechism's never been revised. The idea's never been removed. Every pope has called for every bishop to have an exorcist, going back how many, I think 3 or 4 popes at this point. So this idea is not in line with the church's teaching, and it's been the consistent teaching of the church since Jesus. And so to say that he doesn't exist, you're going against the magisterium, you're going against the catechism, you're going against sacred scripture. You're saying that Jesus was either incompetent or lying. So you're putting yourself in an interesting position if you're still claiming to be Catholic and yet speaking against Jesus, against the Bible, against the magisterium, and against the catechism, right? So it's not really a tenable position once it's actually challenged. But in the church in the more modern world, and I think to some extent trying to, at that time trying to welcome the world and relate to the modern world, perhaps this idea gained a little traction for a little while, because in the seminaries, I've heard from a lot of priests that went through in the 70s that they were told, that this doesn't exist. And if somebody says they're possessed, send them to their psychiatrist.
Right. I hear people occasionally say that the exorcism, the possession concept is wrong, that these people are suffering from mental illness. What three signs would you say shows you that this is more than a mental illness or signs of possession?
Well, the classic signs of possession. Okay, so the church figured out centuries ago that most people that think they're possessed are either mentally ill or seeking attention, right? So about 80% of the people that think they're just misunderstanding mental illness. Um, Schizophrenia is the most common one because, you're hearing voices and you're trying to make sense of that and understand it. Bipolar with psychotic features is a possibility. There's just psychosis induced through substances. I've seen people that have gone through what they interpreted as possession states after taking certain drugs. Um, I've seen people have strange sensory experiences from a small brain tumor that was pushing on the brain and causing some sensory disturbances, and they interpreted that as possession. So the church figured out a long time ago, you have to be careful with this. You don't just, because somebody says they want an exorcism, you don't just say, okay, I believe you, you're possessed. And she figured out that there's basically four signs that are the classic signs of possession. And these, when they're substantial and well documented and thorough, I think they really escape rational explanation. And that's why these are those signs. So the first one and the most commonly used is knowledge of all languages. So schizophrenia doesn't make you suddenly fluent in ancient languages, right? It just doesn't. Um,
Have you seen that?
oh yeah, many times.
Really?
Yeah,
That would be
yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. Um, there was a case here in Pennsylvania, not in my diocese. It's the example that I always give for this. Because there was a number of priests there on a particular day, and it was a person that was raised on a farm in a rural area with a high school education here in Pennsylvania. They only know English, and they were interrogated in English, French, Latin, Lithuanian, and German, and properly responded to all the languages. Um, we've seen them speak Hebrew during sessions. We've seen them speak Latin, of course, usually to correct the priest's Latin. If there's a slip in pronunciation, because they know the exorcism right inside and out because they've been through it for thousands of years. The most obscure one I've seen, there was one that wouldn't speak, but it would write the answers. It was mute, and that does sometimes happen. And it wrote the answer in Icelandic, but it used the grammatical form from about 600 years ago. And luckily, I had a friend in Iceland who knows enough about their language, who was able to translate it. But it would be as if we were to say read Old English, where you would say, I can basically see what it's saying, but we don't speak like this anymore. It was like that. And this was a person in the southwest of the United States who never went to Iceland and doesn't know anything about it. And if you know Icelandic, it's an incredibly difficult, strange, obtuse language for a Westerner. So anyway, knowledge of all languages is the easiest one to test for. Knowledge of hidden things. So the spirit knowing your secret sins, knowing details about your life that this person has no way of knowing. And they're very specific. It's not vague, like, oh, you have a car. Like, okay, everybody has a car. But something very specific, like, oh, we saw you when you made your ham sandwich at 11 o'clock on Saturday, or, that's a silly example, but something very specific. It is true that they do like to reveal people's sins if they're unconfessed, to shame them and try to scare them away from the ministry when they're brand new to it. So they will do that. So knowledge of hidden things is the second one. Detecting the holy is the third. So you can put out 4, 10 identical bottles of water that you would buy, typical water that we drink every day. And one of them was blessed before the person arrived. They all look identical. They can pick out the blessed one every single time. And that's in the human state or in the demonic state. Because when they're in the human state, the demon in them is reacting to the water. And so they'll say, that one makes me nervous. I don't want to touch that bottle. And they'll identify it every single time. I've seen them spontaneously name the saint whose relic is in my pocket that I didn't mention to anybody that I had brought to the session. Um, one example, you might sprinkle exorcised and blessed salt, a few grains of it, on all the chairs in the room except one that's an awkward one in the corner and hard to get to. And you come in and you let the person sit anywhere they like. And they go to the effort to go over and push their way to the corner to the one chair in the room that doesn't have a few grains of blessed salt on it. And of course, you can't see them. On and on like that. So detecting the holy. And then the last one is strength beyond their condition. So, people say supernatural strength, but that's the improper word because only God is above nature. So when we say supernatural, that super, of course, means above. Only God is above nature. So it would be preternatural strength, which is beside, but outside of nature, but not above it. And this one is the hardest one to rely on. If you've ever, and you probably have seen this, I've worked in prisons and psychiatric settings for a number of years, a couple different prisons here in Pennsylvania in psychological services, and a lot of the mentally ill are housed there. The last prison I worked at was SCI Laurel Highlands, which is essentially the hospital for the Pennsylvania prison system. So anybody with a serious medical problem, it's an old state hospital that's been converted to a correctional hospital. And my block was the hospital. I was the psych for the hospital. So um, in those settings, in psychiatric settings particularly, you can see incredible strength for short periods of time. When somebody goes into a psychotic rage for whatever reason. And I've seen people do incredible things, like unbelievable, like a steel desk leg that is literally cemented into the floor in a psychiatric observation cell. It's welded to a steel plate that is the desk. It goes down into the concrete in the floor, and it's an L-shaped piece of steel, thick. I saw a man with one arm. He was missing one of his arms. A man with one arm work it out, rip it out of the floor, off the desk, and then break through a safety glass window in the door that literally we were told was unbreakable. Like the contract for the place, that spec for that is that it was unbreakable, and he broke through it. So anyway, the difference with the demonic strength is that they never get tired.
Okay.
So the strength is as much as God allows them to exhibit, and 3 hours, 5 hours later, they're normally you'd get that adrenaline for a certain period of time. We probably use about 15% of our muscle fibers on any one contraction. We don't use them all. So the person's using most of them, they're excreting a lot of adrenaline, they're going to be shaking and exhausted, their sugar's depleted, et cetera, within a short period of time. These people are not tired, they're not sweating. When the exorcism's over, they don't experience fatigue. They're just like, oh, what happened? Their body is not wrecked from the exertion that they've been going through. So it's a very different type of strength than just an adrenaline rush. So when you're diagnosing the strength you wouldn't really use, the demon's trying to hide and not show itself. So it's not going to be throwing people around the room. You're going to be going after languages, see if they know hidden things, and detecting the holy.
Now, in your book, you used the term infestation versus oppression. Could you give the definition of that?
Yeah, so the church just uses demonic infestation as basically when they're active in a place, so typically a home. And really technically it means they've gotten permission from God to do extraordinary things in that home beyond their normal activity, which is temptation. So that's a demonic infestation. That's like shadows moving around that can't be explained, balls of black smoke that don't dissipate, horrible odors you can't debunk that move around as if a person's walking, people waking up or being scratched in threes, being bruised, horrific repeating demonic nightmares every time you sleep in that house, but you sleep elsewhere and you have no problem, all kinds of things like that. That's a demonic infestation. Then the church has oppression or obsession, depending on how the word is rendered from obsessio in the Latin. And that's essentially an attack on the person. So now the attack is not on anybody that wanders into that house, but now the attack is on a person, and wherever that person goes, they're attacked. So it's not limited to the location. And that's to wear the person down to either suicide or give into possession. And then there's demonic possession, which we all know that means they have the ability to take over the body.
Now, say you have someone that you think may be possessed. What kind of studies would you do before you say, yeah, we need to proceed with a major exorcism?
Right. So there's two steps. The first big hurdle is ruling out the medical, the psychiatric and psychological. And by that I mean like brain-based psychological problems versus, say, environment-based, just, mood disorder because I had a rough childhood kind of thing, versus an actual brain-based psychiatric etiology for a mood disorder. So we mentioned schizophrenia, for instance. So if somebody, I'm doing the intake interview, I've been around a lot of mental illness over the years, more in a psych capacity. If a person sounds classically schizophrenic to me, and I ask them follow-up questions, and I'm asking diagnostic questions that are typical for schizophrenia, and it all fits, and they're saying, but no, I'm possessed, and I'm asking the questions about typical experiences of possessed people, genuine possessed people. I'm not telling them what the right answer is. I'm just saying, well, tell me about this. And there's none of those indications. I'm not even going to encourage that person to be evaluated spiritually in the context of a prayer session, because schizophrenia involves delusional thoughts. Delusional thoughts are fixed ideas that resist being challenged. So you could say, like, the CIA is out to get me. And you say, well, no, that's not reasonable. I say, oh, you're one of them then. See, they're out to get me. The idea resists challenging. If you bring somebody into a diagnostic prayer session with an exorcist and they're delusional, you're actually doing a lot of harm, because now they're going to say, well, no, I don't need the medication. I am possessed. The exorcist stood over me with a crucifix and was saying all this stuff, and they were testing me for possession. They must suspect, they know I'm possessed, and you can actually do a lot of harm. So the very first level is that interview of saying, like, well, are you off your medication? Do you have a history of mental illness? Are you willing to sign a release with your doctor is a big one. We have them sign a release with the doctor to give permission to talk with us. We get permission from them to talk with the doctor about what they've told us, and we get everybody on the same page if they have a treatment team. Now, interestingly, I've been surprised at how many psychiatrists, after we've discussed it, have said, when I see signs of what seems to be a genuine spiritual problem, I've been surprised at how open doctors have been about, well, after we talk about it, saying, well, let's try it and see what happens, after it's explained to be a reasonable process. So that's the first big step. And the bottom line is, usually we ask the person to get a psychiatric evaluation or psychological evaluation from a therapist, depending on what's going on. If they're already in treatment, we ask them to sign a release with their doctors, so that we're not, in a situation where they're basically controlling information. Of course, I didn't tell the doctor I'm hearing voices. They'll just lock me up. Of course, I didn't tell them that, but I have my psych eval. Well, that's not really a psych eval if you're not describing the one symptom that we're trying to figure out, right? So yeah, that's the big first important step, is getting that outside professional look at it. And the question, by the way, is not that the doctor diagnose whether they're possessed or not, because that's not the doctor's
Right.
competency, right? The the question the church is asking the doctor is, does this sequela of symptoms match something within medicine? And does this seem like a typical case to you that's treatable? And if they say, yeah, everything here fits with bipolar with psychotic features, for instance, that was a case I was dealing with today. That's why it's on my mind. And if the doctor says that, we say to the person, you've got to try your meds. Try them for as long as the doctor says it's going to take to have an effect, usually 4 to 6 weeks for psych meds. And then let's see if the symptoms go away. And then we'll revisit the spiritual hypothesis. So that's often the conversation that we're having. Now, there's people that have no mental health background at all, and they seem very reasonable. They're trying to debunk what's going on. They're not acting like a delusional person. And even then, we may ask them to go to the effort of getting kind of a psych eval.
Now, say you have a patient that you think, we got to look into the spiritual. What sacramentals would the priest bring to an exorcism?
Well, the ones that are required by the book would be a crucifix and holy water and his purple stole, which is actually a sacramental itself, too. Sacramentals are just essentially blessed things that help prepare us for the sacraments. So they bring grace into our lives. They're blessed, and they help move us towards the sacramental graces, which are considered primary. But most exorcists, in addition to that, will have relics, and relics are first class, which is a piece of the body of a saint, maybe a hair from their head, maybe a chip of their bone, mounted in a reliquary. Almost all exorcists have a bunch of relics in addition to holy water and a crucifix. In addition to that, you usually do this kind of thing in a chapel. So it's kind of filled with blessed objects around the person. And you're relatively close to a tabernacle, meaning maybe within 20 feet usually of a tabernacle. You're not bringing the Eucharist out of the tabernacle, but being that close to the presence of Jesus, in that particular way in the Eucharist is a big spiritual impact too.
If you weren't in a chapel, would you bring the Blessed Sacrament with him typically or not?
No,
No.
no, because the book actually warns the exorcist to not bring out the host unless there's some extraordinary reason that he's very sure that things will be under control, because the chance for the host to be desecrated, spit on, or something like that is too high. And so the book warns the priest not to do that.
Doesn't the exorcist try to get the demon to state its name? Is that part of it?
Yeah, so the demon is commanded to give its name. So there's only a few questions that are allowed within the book, that are in the text. And that is, what's your name? When did you enter this person? And how? And when are you leaving? So really kind of three general questions. The priest is allowed to ask other questions, and the introductory notes say that the priest can explore anything related to figuring out how to how this demon entered, and therefore how to get it out of the person. But really, those are the three questions that he demands the answer to. The name is important because when you pray against something by name, it seems to have a greater effect. And also, when something within the spiritual realm, when something gives its name to you, it's giving authority to you over it. And so it's either that the demon has lost its hold on the person, and so it gives over its name because it's basically already defeated and it's on the ropes, or Jesus makes it do it and give up its name. And then sometimes they resist giving up their name, which is a clue that they still have some hold over the person, some unconfessed sin or some unforgiveness, something like that, that we need to figure out and help the person undo that. And so the name, and by the way, it's not required. So it's not like, well, if you don't get the name, you can't get
Right.
that demon out. There are many that don't give up a name, but just go.
Now, you mentioned about the demon may say sins that were never confessed or whatever, and I would imagine the priest would have to maintain his humility and not be afraid, no fear, and obedience, and all this. Where does all that tie into this exorcism?
Yeah, so really the two pillars that keep an exorcist safe and make him effective is humility and obedience. And the more years you spend in this work, the more deeply you realize that. Jesus is really the one doing all this. He's the one ultimately telling the things the day that he has decreed they're going to go, and telling them to go. And he often sends his mother for the final one to be the one to deliver the news from him for the final spirit. But Jesus is the one doing it all, and he's the one providing the protection. There's a big danger in this work of the priest developing pride and thinking that he's special and powerful because he's doing this really heady stuff. You know, he's essentially reenacting miracles that Jesus did in the Gospels. It can lead to a lot of pride and a lot of delusions of grandeur. And so humility is a great way to remember that you're nothing and you're small. And it's really the church and Jesus that's doing this. You're the instrument. It's important that you say yes and that you do it, but you're not personally important and you have no power unto yourself. Yes, in your priesthood, you have power, but that's a priesthood that Jesus gave you, right?
Right.
So anyway, humility is huge. Obedience is huge because you're dealing with a creature whose very nature is disobedience. So the last thing you want to do is be breaking the rules when you're trying to deal with the king of disobedience, right?
Yeah.
And if you do start breaking rules, they will immediately call you on it.
Okay. Share with us, if you would, maybe one of your memorable first thing that comes to your mind when we're talking about an exorcism. You've witnessed many. Uh,
Mhm.
just for people that listen to this and say, "Wow, this is real."
Oh, that it's real? Um, boy. I mean, I know, there's some things that are too disturbing to talk about, that people don't want to hear, but those are mostly just disturbing. Um, I've seen a person reach out their hand and, stare at a screw that was in the wall to hold up a painting across the room that was nobody was near, and they reached out towards it, gesturing towards it, and it ripped out of the wall, flew across the room into their hand, and then they stabbed themselves with it. Um, we've seen cases where when you would bring something holy into the house, like a blessed statue or a Bible, and somebody was living there as possessed. This was a really serious case, and you set it on the maybe the table in the living room, and you go to get a glass of water in the kitchen, and you're there for 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and you turn back and it's gone, and the possessed person just sitting there smiling. Nobody's opened any doors, the windows are still closed. You can flip the couch over, open every cabinet in the room, look under everything. It's not there. And this happened probably more than 100 times in that case,
Mm.
where no crucifixes could be kept in the house, no Bibles, no holy statues, anything that was brought in would disappear within minutes, or longer if you kept your eyes on it. As soon as the eyes were off it, it was gone. Weird stuff like that. I've seen doors crash open with nothing there, as the spirit was calling out for help from its friends. They don't actually have friends, by the way, but from other demons. Gosh, what else? I've seen them talk about details from my life that made an impression on me, things they couldn't possibly know.
That
Oh
leads me
gosh.
to a thought, Adam, about
Mm,
because you're not a priest. Doesn't the
mhm.
priest usually bring people to pray with him when it's alone? Does he, or typically?
Yeah, so an exorcist would never operate alone. Um, Ideally, they have at least one or two other priests there, either to pray and support, or ideally, you'd have two exorcists in a diocese so they could take a rest, and the other guy could pray for a while. And you never spend any time with the person without female witnesses. So there's, in our case, there's at least two mature, well-known, trustworthy women that will sit and pray rosaries nearby where they can see everything that's going on at all times. Sometimes three or four, but at least two. So you would never, put yourself in a position to be accused of something falsely, because the demons will certainly happily do that. Um, and but it's not a spectator sport either. So it's not like it's open to anybody from the parish who wants to come pray.
Right, right,
This is it's not done in a church that's open. The public cannot come in, that kind of thing.
right.
I'm there. I'm in an unusual position, very unusual as a layperson, because I came into this when there was very few exorcists in the country. Now we've trained up a few hundred, um, but the bishops are still asking me to help in this area, which I'm happy to do as long as they keep asking me to do it. I'm essentially a coach. I'm there to help particularly new priests that are new to this, like, okay, now you need to do this. Did you notice that just happened? And um, you know, this means such and such, kind of the art of it, that you pick up over the years and passing on that wisdom, because it's not as simple as open the book and read it.
Right.
Like if you imagine, I don't know, imagine learning how to do therapy with somebody. You could read a book on cognitive behavioral therapy and say, okay, well, I understand what I'm supposed to do. I'll just go in and do this with this person. But when you're actually working with human beings, there's a whole lot of formation and learning that you have to do
Right.
to be able to do that.
And you mentioned blessed objects. Could you share with us what the Saint Benedict Medal is and what its significance?
The St. Benedict Medal uh, is a medal, obviously, that's attributed to St. Benedict. It was originally found in an old crumbling Benedictine monastery somewhere in Europe. I don't remember where. You can find this story online pretty easily, osb.org, I believe. Anyway, um, there was a town that was troubled by demonic manifestations in homes and things that were scaring the people. And people would go and pray at the old monastery on the hill. And whenever they went there, everything was quiet and peaceful, and they had peace. And they noticed that there was this particular painting on the wall, the stone wall in the monastery. Um, and that painting was what we now see on the back of the St. Benedict medal. They didn't know what it meant. And because it's just a bunch of letters, they had no idea what it meant. But eventually somebody found it in an old illuminated manuscript, what it was. And it was the first letters of a bunch of Latin words that were essentially a small exorcism. And so they said, well, this is great. And they started printing that in smaller form on different things. And somebody thought to make it into a medal that you could wear around your neck. So on one side, they put an image of Saint Benedict with some things that are kind of related to his story and his history. And on the back, they have that same classic image. It is the only medal in Catholicism that has an exorcism on the medal. And it does seem to confer spiritual protection. And I've had demons reference the fact that somebody has the St. Benedict medal on their person. It's not displayed, it's not out where they can see it. You know, it's in your pocket or under your shirt, that kind of thing. But they will mention the presence of it. So it is definitely a good sacramental to have. You do need it to be blessed, and there's a particular blessing for it that any priest can do. It used to be it was only a Benedictine priest, but any priest can do now. So if you were to buy it, say at a Catholic gift shop, it wouldn't be blessed because you can't sell a blessed object. So you need to find a priest to do that special blessing for it.
You mentioned also before we wrap the show up about people be praying the rosary. The
Mhm.
demons don't like that, do they?
Yeah. So in my experience, where I'm at in my life, after basically praying in different ways over the years and learning from different people, um, really the rosary is the best spiritual warfare prayer for me. Um, they hate people praying them. They hate being touched by a rosary. Just holding a rosary and it touching the skin during the exorcism, they act similar to the way they act with relics. It's a huge thing for them. Um, they are terrified of Mary consistently. um, you bring up Mary or praying the rosary, or you ask for Mary's intercession or presence to help. Usually the first thing they say is anything but her. Don't call that woman. They'll stop all their bravado and all their show and trying to scare people, and they'll be like, anything but her. Please don't call her. Because they could never touch her. She was conceived without sin. They could never touch her. They could never get close to her. And then she's humble and obedient. Those are her two big traits, right? So even though she's now the queen of heaven, she's still humble. And She's obedient to her son, though. I'm sure she intercedes for us and asks him, favors all the time for us. But her humility and obedience is the opposite of them. And they could never touch her. She was conceived without sin. And then she's a mediatrix of all graces, right? Because through her yes, the Savior incarnated. So she was the medium through which Jesus literally entered creation. So she's a huge figure for them. And the rosary is a wonderful spiritual warfare prayer. I don't think you need anything else. I don't think you need big, exciting prayers that some, any particular person wrote. You can use those. But honestly, Mary is the place to go, in my experience, when you're dealing with demons.
Well, Adam, this has been a fascinating show for me. I've learned so much, and I'm sure our people watching it will appreciate it as well. And again, I want to mention your book, The History of Exorcism, available at Sophia, SOPHIA Institute.com. Adam, keep up the great work and helping people learn the faith, and we hope to have you back soon on Mercy Unbound.
All right. Thank you so much, Doctor. God bless you, and God bless your listeners.
Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for the video portion. The podcast can be heard at anchor.fm/Dr. Brian, Bryan Thatcher, Thatcher, and on all the major podcast forums. I would love to speak at your church or conference, and please consider supporting our efforts to spread the truth to a hurting world. Thank you again. And for more information, go to the website at drbrianthatcher.com.